two engineers. One of them is English, Joseph Paxton, and the other one is French, Monsieur Gustave Eiffel. We're also, underneath all of this, we're looking at the development of this mass culture, popular culture, something that is developing probably beginning with Gutenberg and the printing of the book, and merging into the general tradition of mass culture with things like the Eiffel Tower. Now, let's talk about, in the 19th century, these two European nations. Now, we know that France built the Eiffel Tower, right? So why are we talking about England? Well, if it hadn't been for England, France would not have built the Eiffel Tower. England was the strongest military power in the world. England had just defeated Napoleon. England and France's had essentially no navy. England had many colonies. England was not just the strongest military power, but it was the leader in the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution, 中文学生呢? Yeah, when did it start? Yeah, about then. Where? Yeah, right. Now, in the 18th century in France, France was a very strong culture. What was France based on? France was based on agriculture, growing things. France is a wonderful country for growing things, not just wine, but wheat and corn. And France had developed agriculture. Now, after Napoleon's defeat, France founded what's called the Second Empire. When Louis Napoleon came back, he was elected president of the Third Republic, and then he staged a coup, took control of France, and became another emperor. He was the third Napoleon, and it was the Second Empire. Now, in this period, in these 18 years, France was trying to regain what it had before the Revolution. In the Revolution, it lost all of its colonies. It lost the western part of North America. It lost its colonies in England. It lost many of its colonies in the Caribbean. Without a colony, you couldn't be an empire, could you? You need colonies. Partly for money and trade, and also partly for prestige. If you don't have any colonies, you don't feel that you're important. So, France had been collecting colonies. Algeria in North Africa. It tried to get Mexico. It tried to put a French relative of Napoleon III in charge of Mexico, but it didn't work out and he lost his life. It started colonies in Vietnam and Cambodia. It, along with the other nations like England and Germany, also started in China to develop colonial-like trade. But in 1870, France was defeated by a small country in Europe that people never really thought of very much. This country was called Prussia. 那个中文是那个普法战争. Now, Prussia, France didn't imagine it could be defeated by this small country. So when the Prussian troops walked into France, they captured the Emperor Napoleon III in the battlefield. This was a terrible shock to France. France had never been defeated before. So France needed to do something to regain its pride in itself as a country. As you all know, French people, when you talk about French people, are French people very humble? No. People always say French are very arrogant. I always thought that too, and then I went to Paris this summer again, and the French people are really nice. They're very nice. They're not arrogant, but they're very proud of their culture and their history. And they would not want to have this shame on them. So they wanted to get a symbol. Now, along with this historical background, let's look at two people. These are these two engineers. The first one, and I'll talk more about them in a minute, is Joseph Paxton. Joseph Paxton was an Englishman, a very practical person. He was lived a generation before Eiffel, and Eiffel was French. We'll talk about both of these people and how these two people together led to the construction of the Eiffel Tower. Also, in terms of international conflict, when we talk about globalization, we think globalization means cooperation. Well, it does, but actually, globalization also means conflict. Now, in the later 19th century, it was not conflict on the battlefield. It wasn't war, it was conflict, economic conflict between industry and trade. What was high-tech industry and what was international trade. It was also conflict for reputation. Countries wanted to understand what was their reputation, why were they as good or even better than other countries. And it was also conflict in terms of technological and scientific developments. These had begun in the 18th century with national research institutes in France, in England. And they were continuing into the 19th century with practical applications of this science and technology. Now, here's the World's Fair. We finally get to see a picture of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower here was part of what's called the Exposition Universelle. And this happened in 1889 in Paris. It's a World's Fair. Here you see, this is a general picture of most of the buildings here. This river is the Seine, which flows through the middle of Paris. The World's Fair was in an area, Champs des Invalides, on one side of the Seine, and then there was some on the other side there too. This Eiffel Tower looks like it's drawn too big. Actually, it's not. Actually, the Eiffel Tower really is that big. So, I'll talk about what led up to the background of the construction of this tower and the background of this World's Fair. Now, first of all, the history of World's Fairs. We know nowadays there's a World's Fair every 4 years. There's a committee somewhere, I don't know where, somewhere, a committee that decides which country will get the next World's Fair. There's a lot of competition for it, but in the 19th century and the early 20th century, there was no committee. If a country wanted to have a World's Fair, they would get together the money and then do it. So the first one was in England, back in 1756. This one was a small fair. It was just a technological, a trade exhibit. And this was how the World's Fair started, as trade exhibits, not as cultural exhibits. Countries wanted to show the things they made and they sold. Then, following the English ones, there were numerous exhibits in France, mostly after the revolutions. These were all small fairs, not very big. France wanted to try and show that it was doing well after the revolution. Then in 1806, there was a big French exhibit. Napoleon, that's Napoleon I, wanted to promote French products under what he called the Continental System. Anybody ever hear of the Continental System? Yes. What is it? Right. But why did it exclude England? Well, England was at war with Napoleon, and it wasn't just that France didn't want to cooperate, they couldn't. England had its ships going all around France, and they didn't allow other countries to have ocean trade with France. It's what's called a blockade. So Napoleon, because the French Navy had been destroyed in Egypt when Napoleon went to Egypt, so Napoleon developed what he called a Continental System. It's kind of like the EU is now. Napoleon wanted to have free trade between European countries, and he was having this exhibit in 1806 to show this trade. It was a pretty big exhibit. After this, there were many exhibits, many places. The United States, Italy, other European countries, even starting in some countries outside of Europe. In 1844, this is after France had rebuilt from Napoleon, there was a large French industrial exposition that showed France's industrial abilities, which at this point were better than they had been. England, in response, wanted to have a much larger exhibit. So this was the time of Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. They wanted to have a really great exhibition. This was not just international, it was going to be great, the best one the world had ever seen. And this exposition was going to, first of all, show England's capabilities in several ways. First of all, in terms of industrialization, show how industrialized, how modern England was, how powerful its factories and its scientists were. Show this internationalization, how England, this little island, was connected culturally and artistically, educationally to all the other countries of Europe. And here this is the inside of the England's 1851 Great Exhibition, and they have all kinds of art from different countries. It's not very good art, it's Victorian art, but they're showing how England is connected to other countries. They're showing England's art and its history. England's history and also its cultural advancement. Now, the exhibition had two things it wanted to achieve. First of all, it was educational. Taipei had an exhibit about a year ago of flowers. What was that called? In Chinese, do you remember? Yeah, did you go there? Everybody went there. Was that educational? Did you learn things from it? Well, were you supposed to learn things from it? About ecology? Maybe. Well, that's the way these exhibits are. They say, you go to these things, you buy your ticket, you really want to have fun, but they say you will learn something, and you think, oh, that's good, so I'll go. But in addition to educating people, the exhibit was supposed to be profitable. It was supposed to make money, basically through selling tickets. Now, in order to have this exhibit, there was a committee and they needed a building. They needed a very big building because this was going to be the biggest exhibit in the whole world had ever seen. And this building had to be inexpensive. It couldn't cost a lot of money because the exhibit wasn't funded by the government. The king or the parliament weren't paying for this. People were going to invest some money in it. So it couldn't be very expensive. And after the exhibit, they needed to take the building down and build it somewhere else, because they needed that land for something that was more important, like a park. They were using a park, they were going to build a building on it, and when the fair was over, they wanted to get rid of the building and build it again somewhere else.